You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio here. It is Wednesday night, February 5th. We are a little under 24 hours after Indiana got boat raced in Madison. We're going to talk about that primarily. Not a long podcast, but felt like we needed to do a midweek update on things and a recap where we sit after Indiana loses at Wisconsin again. 1998, the last time Indiana won up in Madison. And as you all know, a lot's happened since then. But we're going to talk about that and talk a bit about where Indiana goes from here and some of the things that are most problematic, I guess you could say, heading into this next stretch of games and what we should think about and what we should expect. First, a couple of reminders. We've been talking about this on Twitter and a couple of other places, and we've mentioned it on the pod, but I just wanted to remind everybody we're going to be back in Bloomington. I'm in Bloomington, but our friends from across the Back Home Network are going to be here in Bloomington this Saturday at the Upstairs Pub, starting at noon and running through and after the IU Michigan basketball game, as we have our Back Home Network get-together / reunion. We bring everybody home, or as many people as we can. So it'll be me at the Upstairs Pub, and Scott from Crimson Cast going to be there as well, around noon to 1, all the way through the game. If you went to the event last year that we had at the Upstairs Pub, you'll know how the drill works. We're going to be talking before the game. We'll be doing some break-ins during commercials. We'll talk at halftime and then post-game. And that's always a lot of fun. We enjoy seeing you folks out there. Hopefully we get a lot of you out there. We can hopefully celebrate IU playing well at home in a game that they desperately need to win. And even if not, we'll be able to commiserate and watch together if they don't quite get to that mark. And then, of course, afterwards, we'll be joined by the crew from Assembly Call, at least most of them. Ryan Phillips is going to be there. Coach Tonsoni's going to be there. I don't think Jared or Andy are going to be able to make it, but we're looking forward to meeting with them. And we'll do a little post-game, not really a podcast per se, but a live event. And, you know, if you've been to the Upstairs Pub lately, you know it's the place to be. If you haven't been to the Upstairs Pub, you will soon find out that it is indeed the place to be. The event sponsored by Jack Daniel's Fire, and the event itself will also be fire, as we'll have a lot of your friends and the people that you are used to seeing and listening to on the podcast. We'll talk some IU basketball. We'll talk some IU football. We'll talk some IU women's basketball as well, and have a good time. And that's really what it's all about, getting a chance to see you folks in person, whether it's during the game if you're not going, or whether it's after the game if you are going. We look forward to seeing you there. So again, we're going to start around noon at the Upstairs Pub on Saturday. And, of course, just a reminder to everybody, there's no cover at the Upstairs Pub. It's always a cover-free environment. And they'll have Breakfast Club in the morning. They're going to get Breakfast Club going later than normal, which I think is actually good. I think everybody needs the break. So Breakfast Club at 9 a.m. that day. And you're going to have a bunch of stuff going on during that day that you're going to want to keep an eye on. Also on Friday, the day before, they've got 50-cent wings, $3 game day lagers from Upland. A lot of great stuff going on at the Upstairs Pub. We're looking forward to seeing you folks there. And just stay tuned either on the podcast feed or on X or some of the other spots that you get us, the Discord, for those of you that are in that community. And we'll continue to feed you some info as we move forward. Hope to see you there at the Upstairs Pub. That event, again, sponsored by Jack Fire. Also, just a reminder, folks, we're brought to you by Home Field Apparel. The day that many of you and me have been waiting for finally arrived, and you've been seeing social media pictures of it all across the various networks as the Lee Corso era crew necks, which I'm wearing right now for those of you who are watching on video. They have finally arrived, and they are a treat. This is a really, really, really good look. And I mean, on other people, maybe not so much on me, but I'm wearing mine right now. It's warm. I love the little turtleneck top. It's snug. It's cozy. We need it on today. It's ice raining outside in Bloomington. So this really got here right at the right spot. Home Field Apparel continuing to put out amazing stuff And you can take advantage of that by going to homefieldapparel.com. Use the code HOME23. Get 15% off your first order. They've got wonderful crew necks and hoodies like this. They've got great T-shirts. They've got long sleeves. They've got three-quarter tees. They've got anything you could ask for in collegiate apparel, and even some stuff outside the collegiate apparel category. So get yourself outfitted with Home Field apparel, and you can use the code HOME23 again and get a discount on the first order. Head over there. Tell them we sent you. Also, quick reminder, we're on Substack, crimsoncast.substack.com. Please check in with us there. We'd love to have you as part of the free newsletter community as we deliver podcasts right to your inbox, and occasionally some extra stuff, which you can opt into if you're feeling a little spicy with things. So anyway, let's go ahead and dive in, talk a little bit about what happened in that game last night. I don't think anybody was surprised that Indiana went in and lost at Wisconsin, especially after playing as well, or at least as hard, relatively speaking. Some of you were critical of me saying Indiana played well at Purdue. I think they played fairly well overall, but they did not play fairly well against Wisconsin. It was very much a one-sided affair and was basically that from the opening whistle. It was unfortunate because Indiana really needed that game. They needed to stem the tide of the losses. They needed to get the confidence that they had in the Purdue game to translate over to another tough environment, but not an unwinnable environment. And instead, they reverted right back to a large degree to how they looked in the Illinois game, in the Iowa game, just not really with it. And, you know, they let Wisconsin go on a 26-4 run over the first 7 minutes or so of the contest. They did chip away. They started playing a little bit better defense. You know, they got the lead down to 40-28. It was 42-28 technically, and then they took a basket off of the board, off of a goaltend that had been erroneously called on Omar Ballo. And they came out in that second half, and you thought, well, you know, someone in the studio for Peacock was like, well, they weathered the storm. I was like, well, they didn't really weather the storm. They were still down by 12 or 14. But at least the game wasn't a complete loss at that point. And they had a real opportunity to come out in the second half and kind of do to Wisconsin what Purdue did to Indiana in the game on Friday, which would be come out, play really hard, really be aggressive, you know, try to chop the lead down to 8 or 6 and really make it a ball game. Instead, they went backwards, and very quickly it was a 19-point lead again, 51-32. And from there, Wisconsin essentially coasted. At one point, Wisconsin was up 68-45. It was a 23-point game with about 5 minutes to play. Indiana, as they did earlier this year, really put the press on the second and third stringers at the very end of the game, really played hard there, and got that lead whittled down to 12. Good for analytics, which is nice, but as Zach Osterman said in his piece in the Indy Star, the scoreline very much flattered Indiana in terms of how they played. It was not a 12-point game. It was a 20-point game, essentially, if not slightly more than that. So let's talk a little bit first about the game, the aftermath of the game, with Woodson's comments and some disturbing but unsurprising trends we've been seeing with those, and then we'll talk a little bit about bigger picture stuff. So, you know, the game itself, I think one of the things that's worth noting with this IU team is that they have really shortened the rotation here lately. Some of that's been due to injury. You know, they've obviously not had Kanan Carlisle available recently. Malik Renew was injured. He's been slowly getting back some minutes. He ended up playing 17 minutes in this Wisconsin game. But they've really relied on a very small number of people playing a large number of minutes. Luke Goody came off the bench and played 35 minutes in the game last night. Anthony Leal's gotten a lot of run, although not nearly as much last night. Trey Galloway's getting a lot of minutes off the bench. Omar Ballo's played a ton. Miles Rice has been mostly consistent. And then Mackenzie Mbako is, you know, his minutes have gone up and down, but that's kind of been the crew. Like that particular group of players has been the ones that have gotten the lion's share of the minutes. And from my eye, it really does look like that group is exhausted at this point. You know, Goody, it's a road game, you know, and he had a better game against Purdue. I thought he played hard in this one. Didn't have as good of a statistical outing, 11 points, 5 rebounds, 1 assist, 2 steals. Trey Galloway, after having a really good game against Purdue, kind of backslid, was good from the field, at least from two, and certainly was better in terms of the passes he was getting out there. It was 5 assists, only 3 turnovers. But, you look across the board with this Indiana team, and that particular group has really gotten a lot of mileage over the course of the last couple of weeks. Ballo especially, as over the course of, and Scott mentioned this on the podcast we did this weekend, Ballo had a string where he played 34 or more minutes, 5 consecutive games coming in to this Wisconsin game. He only played 26 points and had by far his worst offensive performance in an Indiana uniform. And actually the 4 points that Ballo scored, you got to go all the way back to January 4th of 2024 when he was still in an Arizona uniform to find a game where he scored only 4 points. And that was actually the only game. It's fascinating. Like the last night's game, you have to go all the way back to his sophomore year to find a game where he scored fewer points in a game. And that was, he scored 1 point against Washington State in January of 23. So Ballo, as much as he got criticized earlier on this year, has really stepped up over the course of the last several games. And, for IU fans who might think that he's, overweight or low effort or whatever, and, with the controversy surrounding the bar visit or whatever, like Ballo's played really well lately and has really been an important piece of the puzzle. Last night was the first game in a while he'd had only like 6 rebounds total. You have to, again, you go back through the statistics and you have to go back to the Gonzaga game to find a game where he had fewer, it's like 6 or fewer rebounds in a game. So it was an outlier from that perspective. There's a strain with this team, and last night started about as bad as you could. I actually do think they deserve a little bit of credit for not completely giving up, but they were also never in the game to begin with, and that is problematic. I don't know if Anthony Leal got injured or if he just didn't fit in the plans, but his minutes essentially got gobbled up last night by Luke Goody, Trey Galloway, and Bryson Tucker, who had been MIA for a while. Played 4 minutes against Purdue, didn't play the 3 previous games. He did have a bit of an injury earlier, but it was puzzling to come out and watch him play as much as he did in the Wisconsin game. And perhaps there was an injury there that we weren't totally familiar with. But it was a lineup and an approach that was out of step with the way Wisconsin was playing. It was interesting listening to the in-game commentary and the halftime commentary on Peacock. I think it was Jordan Cornette made the point that playing Omar Ballo for as many minutes as Indiana did, especially in the first half, didn't make a lot of sense because he didn't really fit within the flow of the game. But as Cornette pointed out, if you're going to play him there, you really got to run the offense through him and try to punish Wisconsin with his physicality and with really shoving it into the post. And Indiana really didn't do that. Ballo only ended up taking 3 shots the whole game. And Indiana was really not looking for him. Wisconsin did a pretty good job of doubling him when they needed to, but they rarely needed to. And Indiana did not do very much at all to get him in a position where he could be an offensive threat. So, you look at all of that and you look at the way that the team played in general, and it really just kind of felt like they were playing the greatest hits, but in reverse. Bad 3-point shooting percentage, only 7 for 27 on the game, 26%. They shot okay from 2, but not nearly well enough to compensate for the lack of threes. They didn't do a wonderful job really in any other phase of things. I mean, other than assisted baskets was about the only thing where you could really look at what IU did and say, okay, well, that stuck out in a positive way statistically. And, you look across the board, the biggest problems were defensive. And, while Indiana's offensive rebounding wasn't great, their defense really let them down in terms of they let a good Wisconsin team essentially get whatever shots they wanted. They did not turn Wisconsin over. They didn't force turnovers. Wisconsin only turned the ball over on 9% of their possessions. So They were letting Wisconsin get full possessions. They were letting them get offensive rebounds, although not as many as perhaps one might have feared. And Indiana, at the end of the day, just couldn't keep up with Wisconsin and what Wisconsin wanted to do. We had talked earlier on in the week about how Purdue, like Wisconsin was kind of an extreme version of Purdue, better offensively, but much worse defensively. And the only chance Indiana, I think, had in that game to begin with was if they were able to score at a clip that would keep them in shouting distance. And Indiana they didn't have the offense for it. They didn't have a game plan. And I think that was the biggest confusion that I had. And maybe I'm being a little disingenuous when I say confusion, because it wasn't necessarily I was confused. I was more just disappointed at how poor not just the effort was at times on defense, but just there didn't seem to be a real recognition about what was needed to be done. And, you look at what Indiana allowed in terms of overall points per possession. And this was yet another game where Indiana was nowhere close to holding their opponent to a point per possession or less. You look at the 6 or the 7 games that Indiana's played here lately, and they've lost 6 out of their last 7. The one game that they won was that Ohio State game. That's the only game in this 7-game stretch where Indiana has not allowed 1.15 points per possession to the opponent offensively. That's just not going to get the job done. Indiana has been a sieve defensively, and you can see the lack of connectedness that this team has on the floor. You can see that they're not on the same page with themselves, with each other, with the coaching staff. And it was so evident at the very beginning of this Wisconsin game. Wisconsin didn't play great once we got past that opening salvo. And, you can look at, the score that existed there at the end of that run, that 26-4 run. And, you take that away, and Indiana won the rest of the game 60-50. But that's nothing to pat Indiana on the back on. Like Wisconsin, they almost looked bored. I think I actually tweeted something like that. They really looked bored with the game after they took that big lead. And they kind of screwed around, and they would score in spurts, but they went several minutes there without scoring at all. I mean, they scored at the 9-minute mark, and then they didn't score again until about the 5-minute and 40-second mark of the first half. They had another stretch between the 5-minute and 40-second mark and the 3-minute mark where they didn't score at all. And it's interesting thinking about, it could have been much worse if Wisconsin had really been trying to prove a point and had really kept their foot on the gas. It really could have been bad. And when you think about Indiana at this point, you're really dealing with a team that just does not have a coherent approach to what they're doing on either side of the floor, but I think especially defensively. And, it's much like a couple of games in this stretch. I think you could almost say that Indiana, from the standpoint of what they did and whether they were able to keep it close or not, they almost are relying at this stage on their opponent not executing rather than Indiana stopping their opponents from executing. And yeah, you'll have individual moments that will be better here or there, but most of the bulk of the game, if you take the whole game in totality, Indiana's just not measuring up. And there's nothing that seems likely to change in that as far as what Indiana is going to be facing with their next 4 opponents, because their next 4 opponents are all top 25 caliber teams, at least in the metrics. And Indiana doesn't look like they're ready to play any of them. That doesn't mean they're going to lose all of them, but at this point, they don't look ready to play a full 40 minutes against any of them. It's hard to reconcile the Wisconsin game with the games that Indiana played in the last 2 outings. Even the Northwestern game, that was a seesaw sort of thing. Indiana ended up on the wrong end of the seesaw, but that was a game of runs against a team that was not awesome. But Indiana was close against Maryland. They were close against Purdue. They just weren't close against Wisconsin. And this is not that special of a Wisconsin team, but it does look like an Indiana team that has found new ways to be confused about what they should be doing, has found new ways to not be on the same page with each other. And this was where it manifested in a bunch of different directions. So you think about what to evaluate next. Like, what is it a lot of people have kind of given up. I was talking to a couple of people today who didn't even bother watching the game, watched a couple of highlights or caught the box score in the morning. I felt like I needed to watch the whole game so I could talk with you folks about it. But the thing I think it's bothersome right now is there's just a complete lack of any answers coming from Mike Woodson when he's asked to address what's going on with this team. He always opens by saying that it's on him. He said that in this game, like, they came out they came out with good intentions, and then they just weren't good. And he was asked some question about like allowing the big run at the start, and he says it's on him, and then immediately turns around and just says our effort was terrible, which is very similar to the radio show comments he gave last week, where he started off by saying, well, hey, it's on me, and then just proceeded to criticize the players for not playing hard enough. Even at this, like the flurry of threes at the beginning, somehow the answer to that was that it was the bigs' fault, that Ballo and Renew were responsible for not guarding the threes that the bigs were taking. It's weird, though, because, like, yes, Nolan Winter, who's 6'11", did hit a couple of threes at the start of the game, but the bulk of the damage done from long distance was not from Nolan Winter, certainly wasn't from Stephen Crowell, even though he did hit one at one point. It was like Max Klesmit hit two, Carter Gilmore hit three, Kamari McGee hit three. A lot of that John Tonji hit one. It was an odd response. And, on the one hand, I'm not a big proponent of reading too much into what any coach says about anything. A lot of coaches just kind of engage in auto speak when they're in these situations. But it is really frustrating that Mike Woodson, he'll say it's on me, but then the finger always gets pointed at the players for a lack of effort or a lack of execution. Whether he's trying to say it's on me to get them to execute better or not, the implication there is, well, I'm going to say it's my fault, but then I'm immediately going to point the finger in the direction of the players. And I think especially criticizing Omar Ballo, which he did by name in the post-game press conference, is pretty unfair, given the statistics and the numbers and the minutes that I read you earlier, when you think about how much Omar Ballo has contributed to this team over the last 5 games. Yes, they've lost those games, but it hasn't been because of Omar Ballo. So now Malik Renew, Renew clearly does not look right. And I think everybody saw that in the Purdue game. I think everybody saw that in the Maryland game. It was Mike Woodson's decision to start Malik Renew over Luke Goody, who has consistently outplayed Renew. To turn around and criticize Malik Renew for not playing well is a weird thing to do. If you think that he's ready to play and he's playing the way that he's played lately, you might want to reevaluate. Now, Renew did have a better statistical game than we've seen recently. It's 6.6 rebounds. That's not nothing. But defensively, he's not there and hasn't been for a while. And that predates the injury. It's just it's disappointing because there's such a systematic lack of consistency with this team, lack of connectedness. Yes, that is on the coaching staff, but then just leave it at that. The players, it's a rough spell in general. I know a lot of people have had individual criticisms of players in certain games. And look, players are going to have bad games. Like Miles Rice had a terrible game against Purdue. Had a fairly good game in this game against Wisconsin. 10 points, was 3 for 4 from the field, hit 4 free throws, had 3 rebounds, had 3 assists. Yes, he had 3 turnovers, had a steal. That's a pretty decent game from a point guard, especially one that was coming off as bad of a game as he had against Purdue, where everybody criticized him heavily post-game. I have a hard time with this constant pointing the finger back at the players when there's a through line in terms of the lack of effort, the lack of connectedness, the lack of effective game planning that runs all the way through last year when a lot of these players weren't on the roster or weren't playing as major a role. It's odd that is the response across the board. Maybe odd's the wrong word. It's just there's got to be different answers for that, and there's got to be different ways to address things. And when you're doing it in the post-game press conference, you might be able to brush off the comments as not being that important. When you're also doing it on your radio show, it becomes a pattern. And when you've seen it in previous comments, I'm curious, like, where does the buck stop with IU basketball? And constantly just saying, I got to get the guys over the hump, as was said again in the pregame radio. You're not giving fans anything to go off of. And yes, I realize for many fans, the ship has sailed. They're out on the Woodson era. They're just waiting for something different. But you've still got to make an effort. I think you still got to make an attempt, because I guess what's concerning about where everything's at now, and we talked about this a bit over the weekend, is this continues to spiral. And this is now yet another season where IU is swooning at exactly the wrong time. You lose 6 out of 7 games. Last year, Indiana, as we know, last 7 out of 9 games, right around the exact same time. Obviously the Trace Jackson Davis' senior year, they didn't have that swoon, but they did lose 3 out of 5 in late February. In 2022, they lost 7 out of their last 9 in the regular season. This is a pattern with Mike Davis's teams. And there just seems to be a lack of self-reflection with Woodson about why this might be happening. And this is where, and again, many people have pointed this out, but Woodson clearly knows a ton about basketball. It doesn't appear like he's got quite the same command of college basketball, because when I hear him talking about players or criticizing players, or the way that he talks about certain things and then essentially points the finger back at the players, it's not a system that works particularly well at the college game, especially when the problems are not a whole lot different than they were in last year or in the 2021-22 season. It's the same types of problems. It's the same sorts of issues. It's the same kind of seesaw, except I'd argue it's worse, because now the defense, which I think is the thing that stands out the most over a long period of time in terms of the impact a coach is having on the way that his team is playing. You look at that 2021-22 stretch where they lost 7 out of 9, and they were in most of those games, and they were playing pretty good defense in most of those games. They had a couple that got away. They had the game at East Lansing that got away that year. But they had a really, they lost in overtime at Ohio State. They lost by 8 at Northwestern. They weren't getting blown out in pretty much any of those games except for the Michigan State one, and even that was a 15-point game. And the program continues to drift further and further away from having a coherent ideology when it comes to how it's being played, the game is being played. And I would like to hear some kind of acknowledgement of that. But it just kind of goes back to something that I've had a feeling on for a while. I think a lot of people share this feeling, which is like, there doesn't appear to be a clear understanding of why things aren't going well with this team on the part of Mike Woodson. And that's, I think, a big reason why things continue to spiral. Looking forward for Indiana, what do they got in front of them? Michigan at home, at Michigan State next Tuesday, UCLA at home, and then at home against Purdue 8 days or 9 days after. So they have a big break right after Valentine's Day that lasts until the 23rd. When you look at that grouping of games, I actually think Indiana could win 3 out of those 4. And it's the 3 home games. I think the Michigan State game is kind of a bridge too far. Michigan looks good. Wish Michigan's not unbeatable. And we've seen teams play poorly on the road in the conference. Does Indiana have what it takes to make things work? I don't think that they do at this point. But Michigan's not invincible. I mean, an Oregon team that frankly has been not that exciting. They've lost some home games. They've struggled. They went into Michigan and lost, but they only lost by 4 points. Michigan probably should have won that game by more. The game at Michigan State, like I said, is a tough one. The game at home against UCLA, that's a schizophrenic UCLA team. I mean, they beat Michigan State last night and looked really good doing it. And they've been on a nice little string here lately where they've strung together like 5-6 really good victories in a row. But the two road games they played that they won, one of them was at Washington, which is not a tough place to play right now, and the other one was at USC, which is a bus ride across Los Angeles. Their away games in conference so far, outside of the Pacific teams, because the other road game that they've won in the Big Ten is Oregon. They won that game by 2 earlier on. But they lost by 8 at Nebraska. They lost by 18 at Maryland. They lost by 7 at Rutgers. This is not a team that plays well on the road where they have to travel long distances. And that's been a reciprocal issue. Like Michigan State went out to LA, lost both of those games to USC and UCLA, and Michigan State was a top 10 team going into the weekend. So, and then you get to the Purdue game. Indiana played Purdue pretty well. I don't know how well Purdue's going to travel. So, like, a lot of people have been like, well, Indiana's not going to win another game this season. Indiana's, they could lose out and miss the Big Ten tournament. I think all those things are unlikely. I actually think Indiana's got a chance here if they put it together a little bit where they could win 2 or 3 of these next 4 games, which doesn't really change much at this point. But it is going to be interesting watching Indiana react. And I do wonder, you look at the disconnectedness with this IU team. Do they figure out a way to piece that back together again against teams that play good defense and who have a good coherent offensive philosophy? My guess would be no, but my guess is also like, I don't see this team losing 8 games in a row. And it's going to be, for me at least, as an intellectual exercise, it's going to be interesting to keep an eye on. For most people, I don't think it's going to be particularly interesting to watch. And this is the problem. It's like at this point, even the diehards have largely tuned out and said, get me to the end of the season. So that's where Indiana's found itself. And I would love anything from the coaching staff, from Mike Woodson, to maybe give people some hope about, hey, here's what's going wrong. Here's specifically what we're trying to fix. Maybe have it reflect in your substitution patterns or who you start or something. There were some baby steps against Wisconsin. They did start Luke Goody and Trey Galloway in the second half, which was something they didn't do in the Purdue game. They went back to the lineup. But at this stage, Indiana just lack guard depth. They lack defensive connectivity. They lack an offensive plan that can effectively change against or versus the opponents that they're playing and what they're doing there. It just all adds up to a really depressing set of watching. And that's where things are at this point. So anyway, I didn't want to go too terribly long, so we're going to wrap it up there. And we'll see what happens with Indiana, Michigan. Again, Indiana only a 4-point projected underdog in this game at home. This is one of the more winnable games on the schedule because it's at home and because Michigan, while they have had some really big wins, they themselves have, the road wins that they've picked up so far on the season. They did win at Wisconsin, but they also lost at Minnesota. It's hard to know exactly what you're going to get out of this Michigan team at this point. And their last 3 games, all wins, they won by 4 points, 3 points, and 4 points. So don't be shocked if Indiana comes out and plays well against Michigan and figures out a way to put something together. I don't know that changes the narrative on the season at all, but I wouldn't be shocked if you were watching that game and it was coming down to the final couple of minutes and Indiana was either leading or in it. So anyway, that'll wrap it up from here. Hope you all have a delightful next couple of days, and I hope we see you all out at the Upstairs Pub on Saturday starting at noon, as we'll be watching Indiana versus Michigan. I'm looking forward to it. I know the rest of the Back Home Network crew are as well. My thanks to Home Field Apparel, our presenting sponsor, and my thanks to all of you for listening or watching. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. Stay never daunted. So long, everybody.